Jane McCall and the Twilight Stacks. Chapter 15. The Flashback. She remembered everything. Everything, all at once. She'd found the stacks in the first place after her dad had left her in the kids' room while taking a call for work. She'd been anxious. Getting left alone even for a little bit had been daunting back then, so she'd hunkered down in the stacks' corner and fiddled with the books on the bottom shelf. One in particular had caught her eye. The wall had opened behind her when she tried to pull it out, and she'd gone through in search of a better place to curl up. Her first impression of the stacks had been an overwhelming sense of safety, wonder, and awe. The room had been huge, with row upon row of shelves tall enough for her to reach the top if she stood on her tiptoes and stretched. Lamps hanging from the ceiling had shades which cast the space in soft, dappled light. Along with the lamps, windows high in the wall showed an endless twilight sky as they provided extra illumination. Dark wood ran along the edges of the ceiling. The shelves were made of the same material and carved with animals, plants, and mythological creatures on the sides. Jane had once spent a full day with a mythology book, an ornithology manual, an animal encyclopedia, and a botany guide in hand, trying to identify all of the different figures. She'd barely gotten through one unit. When she came back next, the forest scene full of satyrs, dryads, olive trees, and narcissus flowers had been replaced by an ocean with selkies, mackerel, kelp, and other aquatic creatures. The shelf itself had teleported 6 inches back and to the left. It had also grown an extra layer. Jane had still examined the carvings from time to time, but knew that the stacks was unlikely to keep any of them in one state for long. Sometimes she swore one of them would wink or smile at her. Jane hadn't known any of that at the time. She'd forgotten all of her fear in favor of wandering through the shelves, pulling out books and running her fingers over the titles and bindings. All of the ones she'd looked at had been either interesting or relevant to her life, but the one she'd picked had been the first in a series of short books about dragons. The shelves had guided her to a small nook in the far back corner where this furniture had stood. It had been pristine and so inviting. Jane had hoisted herself onto the seat and laid the book in her lap. She'd gotten lost in it minutes later. An hour passed. Jane had read story after story. She'd been ready to keep going until she turned a page and saw, "Your dad is looking for you, dear," instead of the next sentence. Jane, being 6 and believing in magic, had not been alarmed by this. Instead, she tilted her head and asked, "Who are you? How do you know that?" "I'm the Twilight Stacks. I know everything," appeared under the previous text as though written with an invisible quill. She'd looked around, impressed by the idea of a living library. One of the lamps had dimmed and brightened in a wink. "Everything? She'd asked, since for some reason infinite knowledge was a harder sell to her baby brain than sentient architecture. "Everything ever written in a book? Come back later and I can teach you a bit. But for right now, you have to go back to your dad. You don't want to get a time out for worrying him, do you?" She'd pouted, but the threat had been effective. She'd hopped off the chair and put the book back, then waved at the room and said, "I'll be back soon." The title on the spine of one of the larger books at eye level had rearranged itself to say, "Don't shout, dear." Jane had giggled, apologized, and left. She told her dad about the encounter. Of course she had. He'd dismissed it as childish whimsy, but did promise to take her back to the library in the next couple of days. When she'd pouted, he'd distracted her with discussions of dinner, hot dogs and french fries. That had satisfied Jane, who had been an easily placated child. They hadn't managed to go back for another week. The call which had distracted her dad had been about a whiteout snowstorm. Inclement weather lasted 3 days, and it took a 4th to get the roads clear. Her parents had been too busy handling the fallout to take her anywhere. Toys had been sufficient distraction. Still, she'd all but bounced into orbit during their next visit. As soon as her mom's eyes were off her, she ducked back to the hidden lever and re-entered the stacks. She'd greeted the place with a little too much exuberance for a library, picked up the next book in the series, and curled up in the chair to read. Over time, this became a routine. Every week, Jane would be escorted to the library, slip her minder, and spend time in the stacks, reading about whatever caught her fancy and basking in the realm's soothing aura. Her initial awe and fascination mellowed into fondness before transmuting into a deep, kind love and respect. Years passed during the transition, with Jane learning more about the world and the Stacks' brand of magic. The Stacks was cast in perpetual soothing twilight, all the better for reading without developing eye strain. It could summon any book from anywhere in the world depending on its patron's needs and interests and communicate by rearranging the text or writing on blank pages. That revelation had prompted Jane to bring in a leather-bound journal so the Stacks didn't have to erase its words after it was done speaking. The gift had pleased the Stacks, if the thank yous which took up the first page were any indication. Jane took to writing in the journal, too, until most of her conversations with the Stacks were text only. When they filled one, she'd leave it and bring in another. It kept the library quiet. Other kids would come in sometimes. They would read on their own or in Jane's company, and Jane would read in theirs on days when she felt lonely. Sometimes the kids would converse with Jane or each other, talking about the books they were reading or personal troubles. None of them held extended talks with the Stacks the way Jane did, though. She didn't question it, out of belief that the Stacks were simply too nice to stop the conversations once she kept reaching out. No adults or teenagers ever entered the Stacks. Jane had asked about it once she'd noticed. The Stacks, ever honest, had told her the hard truth. Nobody over the age of 13 could find the entrance, and those who had found it when they were younger would forget all about the Stacks as soon as they reached that age. They would remember what they'd read, but not where. The only exceptions to finding the Stacks were people with their own magic, witches, and those were rare. The forgetting was a spell intended to protect the Stacks, which was a place for children to feel safe. Part of that involved keeping adults out. Jane, at 12 and a half, hadn't reacted well. She didn't cry or scream or destroy anything, but she'd shut down. It took the Stacks hours to bring her back to something like a normal state. It wasn't the first time it had had to do such a thing for an upset patron. Even once the shock had worn off, the preemptive grief drove her half out of her mind. She spent more time in the Stacks during her last few months than she ever had before. She and the Stacks had filled 2.5 journals with their conversations during that time. The day before her 13th birthday, she'd biked to the library and stayed in the Stacks as long as she could. The Stacks had indulged her, as always, though it had been oddly insistent she read a specific book, first aid and emergency medicine, particularly the chapters on stab wounds and intoxicants. When she'd asked why, the Stacks had written, "Someone close to you wishes to inflict harm, and soon. I will not say who, because you will forget. You will remember the facts in this book, though, and they will save your life." She'd considered that for a moment. The Stacks liked when its patrons thought through problems, answering questions with cryptic comments as often as not. It was a place of learning and growth. Getting straight answers was sometimes like tearing pages, though telling lies was anathema to it. "You're giving me a future." "It's what I do. Someday you'll pass on the favor to someone else." Ripples on the water. Exactly so. Jane had let the conversation trail off and worked to memorize the chapters. It hadn't been too difficult. When she was done, she'd written, "What was the first story I read here?" It had pointed her to the book. It was a thin, colorful paperback with a red dragon on the cover. Even reading slowly, it had taken her less than 15 minutes to get through. When she was done, she'd sighed, put it back, and written in the journal, "I have to go. I don't want to." "Everything has its time, dear," the Stacks had replied, "and by the end of the night you won't remember me. No need to feel sad. I'm going to miss you anyway." She held up the journal. The latest iteration was a red hardcover with gold vines on the front. It was her favorite by far. "Can I leave this here with the rest, even though it's incomplete? For future patrons? It's not like it'll make any sense to me in a few hours." "As a record of our final conversations? I see no reason not to. I am a library, after all. Records are my lifeblood. Will you remember me? I remember everyone. Point the next visitor to this book. Have them add their stories if they want. I love you. I wish you all the happiness magic can give. Goodbye." She'd left the journal on the chair. Stacks could file it at its leisure, and it wasn't like the place had a typical organization system. She'd done her best to replace the books she read, but found them in entirely different places each visit. That was if they hadn't vanished entirely, only to reappear in front of her nose when she requested them, and if the shelves hadn't changed configuration, as was their wont. Tears had filled her eyes as she'd left for the last time. She couldn't help it. Academic knowledge that the Stacks would still be there and that she'd forget was different from the emotions elicited by walking away for good. She held back the tears until she made it home, whereupon she'd hidden herself in her closet and bawled like a baby. Her parents had known something was wrong. How could they not? But Jane had clammed up harder the more they'd pushed, and they'd let it drop in the end. That night, she'd stayed up until midnight, clinging to everything she could remember about her time in the Stacks, and she'd fallen asleep at 12:01, convinced she'd only stayed awake to wish herself a happy 13th birthday. Queries, kudos, or concerns? Like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for listening.